February 1, 1943. The North African sun beat down mercilessly on the airfield near Biskra, Algeria. First Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg walked around his Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress one last time, performing the ritual pre-flight inspection that every pilot conducted before a mission. The aircraft, serial number 41 to 24406, bore the name, All-American, painted proudly on her nose. She was barely 6 months old, having been delivered to the 414th Bombardment Squadron, 97th Bomb Group on August 24, 1942. Bragg had no way of knowing that within a few hours, this routine bombing mission would produce one of the most famous photographs of World War II. He couldn't imagine that his bomber would be nearly cut in half by an enemy fighter, held together by little more than a single thin control cable, yet somehow make it home. And he certainly couldn't foresee that All-American would become a legend, a testament to American engineering, crew courage, and the miraculous resilience of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The mission that day was straightforward: attack the German-controlled seaports of Biskra and Tunis, Tunisia. Intelligence reports indicated heavy enemy shipping activity, making these targets priority number one for disrupting Axis supply lines in North Africa. The 97th Bomb Group would put up everything they had, every serviceable bomber, every available crew. But before that, please subscribe to the channel and like it to spread forgotten stories. Get to the point. Lieutenant Bragg's crew climbed aboard their aircraft. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr. settled into the right seat. Navigator Lieutenant Harry Charles Newsell spread his maps and charts. Bombardier Lieutenant Ralph Burbridge checked his Norden bombsight. Engineer Technical Sergeant Joseph C. James, Radio Operator Technical Sergeant Paul A. Galloway, Ball Turret Gunner Staff Sergeant Elton A. Conda, Waist Gunner Staff Sergeant Michael A. Zook, and Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpelis all took their positions. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, about to face an ordeal that would test them beyond anything they had ever imagined. Chapter 1: The Architecture of a Flying Fortress. To understand the miracle that was about to unfold, one must first understand the B-17 Flying Fortress itself. Boeing designed the B-17 in the mid-1930s as a strategic bomber capable of defending itself against fighter attack while penetrating deep into enemy territory. The nickname, Flying Fortress, came from a journalist who saw the prototype bristling with machine gun positions and declared it a 15-ton flying fortress. The B-17F model that All-American represented was the sixth major production variant. It featured a dozen .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, and had a range of approximately 2,000 miles. But what made the B-17 truly legendary was its durability. The aircraft could absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring its crew home. The B-17's control system was entirely mechanical, no hydraulics, no fly-by-wire computers. Steel cables ran from the control yoke and rudder pedals through pulleys and fairleads the length of the fuselage to the control surfaces on the tail. When a pilot pulled back on the yoke, cables pulled the elevators up. When he pushed the rudder pedals, cables moved the rudder. It was simple, robust, and highly redundant. Multiple cables controlled each surface, and if one cable broke, the others could usually compensate. Usually. The fuselage structure consisted of aluminum alloy frames and stringers covered with aluminum skin, all held together by thousands of rivets. The tail section connected to the main fuselage through a narrow section just forward of the tail gunner's position. This was one of the strongest parts of the airframe. It had to be, given the forces acting on the tail during flight. But even the strongest structure has its limits. The engines of All-American roared to life one by one, first the number 3 engine, inboard right, then number 4, outboard right, followed by number 1, outboard left, and number 2, inboard left. Each Wright R1820 Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine produced 1,200 horsepower, filling the African morning with thunder. Actually, All-American wasn't originally scheduled for this mission. She was listed as a spare, one of several backup aircraft that would take off with the main formation and fill in if any of the primary bombers developed problems. As fate would have it, one of Major Robert Coulter's scheduled wingmen did develop engine trouble before takeoff. All-American moved up to take his place in the formation. The bombers began their takeoff roll just after dawn. One by one, the heavily loaded B-17s rumbled down the dusty North African runway, each requiring nearly the full length to become airborne. All-American lifted off smoothly and climbed to join the formation. Formation flying was both an art and a science. The bombers flew in tight combat box formations designed to provide mutual defensive fire while concentrating their bomb loads on target. Each aircraft had to maintain precise position relative to the others. Too close and you risked collision, too far and you broke the defensive pattern. It required constant attention and skill. The formation climbed to bombing altitude, around 23,000 feet, and turned toward Tunis. At this altitude, the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew wore heated flying suits and oxygen masks. The thin air made every movement exhausting. The unpressurized aircraft rattled and vibrated constantly. But this was routine. American bomber crews flew missions like this every day. Most came home safely. Some didn't. The approach to Tunis was textbook perfect. The formation maintained tight discipline despite sporadic anti-aircraft fire, flak, in the crew's terminology. Black puffs of exploding shells dotted the sky, each one sending thousands of red-hot steel fragments through the air at supersonic speeds. The sharp crack of near misses made the aircraft shudder. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge hunched over his Norden bomb sight in the nose of All-American. This device, one of America's most closely guarded secrets, allowed a bombardier to input airspeed, altitude, wind direction, and target information, then automatically calculate the precise moment to release bombs. During the final bombing run, the bomb sight actually controlled the aircraft's direction, with the pilot simply maintaining altitude and airspeed. "Bomb bay doors open," Bragg announced over the intercom. The huge doors beneath the fuselage swung open with a whine of electric motors, creating massive drag and turbulence. The aircraft shuddered as wind tore through the open bay. "Bombs away!" Burbridge called out. The aircraft lurched upward as 12 500-pound bombs fell away, tumbling toward the harbor installations below. Other aircraft in the formation released simultaneously, creating a devastating rain of high explosives on the target. The bomb bay doors closed, and All-American turned for home with the rest of the formation. The crews began to relax slightly. They had survived the most dangerous part of the mission, the bombing run itself, when aircraft had to fly straight and level through the heaviest flak. But their ordeal was just beginning. "Fighters at 12 o'clock level," someone shouted over the intercom. Multiple Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters dove toward the American formation. These single-seat aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and deadly. Their tactics were to attack head-on, firing their 20mm cannons and machine guns, then roll away before the bomber gunners could track them effectively. Two Me-109s attacked the lead bomber, flown by Major Coulter, and All-American, flying beside it. The B-17 gunners opened fire, their .50 caliber machine guns hammering out streams of tracers. The sound inside the aircraft was deafening, the roar of engines, the pounding of guns, the rush of wind, all mixed into an overwhelming cacophony. The lead fighter took hits from the combined fire of both bombers. It faltered, trailing smoke, and plunged away. But the second fighter pressed its attack with suicidal determination. From his position in the nose, Bombardier Burbridge later recalled, "I was firing at it all the way. I figure one of us must have killed the pilot because the plane crashed right into us." The Messerschmitt, piloted by Erich Paxia, a 16 Victory ace with I/Jagerschwader 53, apparently took fatal hits during its attack run. Either killed or incapacitated, Paxia could not pull out of his diving attack. The fighter's wing sliced into All Americans fuselage just forward of the tail section. The impact was catastrophic. Lieutenant Bragg felt the aircraft lurch violently. I rammed the controls forward in a violent attempt to avoid collision, he later recounted. I flinched as the fighter passed inches over my head, and then I felt a slight thud like a coughing engine. But it wasn't an engine problem. The Messerschmitt's wing had nearly severed All Americans tail section from the rest of the fuselage. What the hell was that? Co-pilot Engel shouted. Bragg checked his instruments. Engine instruments looked normal. But something was terribly wrong with the controls. I checked the engines and controls, Bragg recalled. The trim tabs were not working. I tried to level All American, but she insisted on climbing. It was only by the pressure from knees and hands that I was able to hold her in anything like a straight line. Engel tried his controls with the same result. Both pilots struggled to maintain level flight, fighting against controls that barely responded. Check for damage, Bragg ordered over the intercom. The responses came back quickly, each more alarming than the last. Engineer James reported 2 engines running rough. The number 3 and 4 engines on the right side had taken shrapnel damage. Radio operator Galloway reported that all radio equipment was dead. The electrical system was compromised. And then came the most chilling report of all, from Waist Gunner Zook. Sir, you need to see this. The tail section, it's almost cut off. What Zook saw through the ragged gap in the fuselage was nightmarish. The Messerschmitt's wing had sliced diagonally through All Americans rear fuselage, creating a gash 16 feet long and 4 feet wide at its widest point. The left horizontal stabilizer, the horizontal wing on the tail that controlled pitch, was completely torn away. The vertical stabilizer, tail fin, was damaged. Pieces of the German fighter were embedded in the wreckage. Most horrifying of all, the fuselage was cut almost completely through. Only a small section of the right side of the airframe, some metal near the right horizontal stabilizer, and miraculously, one single control cable kept the tail attached to the rest of the aircraft. One cable. In normal flight, multiple steel cables controlled each control surface. The elevator system, which controlled the aircraft's pitch, nose up or down, had several redundant cables running from the cockpit to the tail. The impact had severed all of them. All except one. That single elevator cable, roughly a quarter-inch in diameter, made of braided steel wire, was now solely responsible for maintaining any pitch control whatsoever. And through this one fragile connection, the pilots could still, barely, control the aircraft. Meanwhile, tail gunner Sam Sarpalus found himself in a terrifying situation. The floor connecting his position to the rest of the aircraft no longer existed. He was trapped in the tail section, which was now connected to the bomber by little more than that single cable and some twisted metal. The tail bounced and swayed in the wind, flexing and bending as the aircraft flew. When Bragg turned the aircraft, the tail twisted sickeningly. Sarpalus had to hang on for his life, knowing that if the tail broke off, he would plummet to his death with no chance of escape. The crew faced multiple simultaneous crises. Control problem. With only one elevator cable functioning, the aircraft wanted to pitch up constantly. The pilots had to use throttle adjustments and sheer physical strength to maintain anything close to level flight. They discovered that by reducing power on the remaining good engines, they could keep the nose from climbing too steeply. Structural integrity. The tail section was literally hanging on by a thread, or more accurately, by one cable and some bent metal. Every moment of flight stressed the remaining connections further. Any turbulence, any violent maneuver, any increase in airspeed might cause complete structural failure. Trapped crewman, Sarpalus was isolated in the tail with no way to reach the rest of the crew. The missing floor made it impossible for him to crawl forward. Engine damage. 2 of the 4 engines were damaged and running rough. Number 4 engine had a serious oil leak that would soon force them to shut it down. Number 3 was barely producing power. No communications, With the radio destroyed, they couldn't call for help, couldn't coordinate with other aircraft, couldn't notify their base of their emergency. The crew had to work fast. Waist gunners Zook and others grabbed whatever they could find, pieces of the German fighter lodged in the wreckage, parachute harnesses, anything with straps or cables, and began lashing the two sections of fuselage together. It was desperate, improvised field engineering. They used the quick-release fittings from parachute harnesses, wrapping them around structural members of both the forward fuselage and the tail section. They wedged pieces of metal from the wrecked Messerschmitt into gaps to provide some additional support. It wasn't much, but it might help hold things together. "Will it hold?" someone asked. Nobody had an answer. Lieutenant Bragg faced an impossible decision. The nearest Allied airfield was approximately 70 miles away, back in Algeria. But to get there, all American would have to turn, and every turn risked snapping the tail off completely. "We're going to take this very slow," Bragg announced to the crew. "Gentlemen, I need everyone to secure anything loose and brace for maneuvering. This is going to be delicate." Bragg began the turn using the gentlest possible bank angle, barely moving the controls, relying primarily on differential engine power to swing the nose around. The turn, which should have taken perhaps 2 minutes at most, stretched out over miles and miles of sky. They actually covered nearly 70 miles just making the turn toward home, almost as far as the distance they needed to fly. Through it all, the tail section bounced and flexed, swaying in the airstream like a fish tail, just as P-51 fighter pilots who later escorted them would describe it. Navigator Nusel plotted the most direct course home. Every extra mile they flew was another mile of stress on that failing structure. The damaged engines became a new problem. Oil pressure dropped steadily on number 4. Black smoke streamed from the cowling. Bragg had no choice but to shut it down and feather the propeller, turn the blade's edge on to the wind to reduce drag. Flying on 3 engines would have been routine under normal circumstances. But with catastrophic structural damage and degraded flight controls, every complication multiplied the danger. All American began losing altitude slowly but inevitably. The pilots couldn't risk aggressive maneuvering to maintain altitude. They just had to accept the gradual descent and hope they had enough height to reach the airfield. As they descended, the bomber fell behind the formation. The other B-17s gradually pulled ahead, leaving All American alone in the sky, a crippled aircraft struggling through hostile airspace. "Fighters! Fighters at 6 o'clock!" 2 more Me-109s had spotted the lone, obviously damaged B-17 and moved in for the kill. A crippled bomber, separated from its formation, was an easy target. But All American was far from helpless. Ball turret gunner Conda rotated his turret to track the attackers. The waist gunners moved to their positions. Even tail gunner Sarpelis, despite his precarious situation, manned his twin .50 caliber guns. The German fighters came in fast, probably expecting little resistance from a bomber that appeared to be breaking apart. They were wrong. The B-17's gunners opened fire simultaneously. Tracers streaked across the sky. The combined firepower of multiple .50 caliber machine guns created a wall of lead that the attacking fighters had to fly through. Sarpelis discovered a new problem. Every time he fired a burst from his guns, the recoil actually pushed the tail section, causing the entire aircraft to yaw slightly. He had to fire in short, controlled bursts to avoid inducing too much movement. The 2 waist gunners, Zook and others, stood with their heads literally sticking up through the huge gash in the fuselage, operating their guns while exposed to the slipstream. The wind tore at them, temperatures were still far below zero, but they kept firing. The aggressive defensive fire worked. The German fighters, damaged by the accurate fire and perhaps surprised by the ferocity of resistance from an apparently doomed aircraft, broke off the attack. All American was alone again, limping toward home. As All American crossed from Tunisia back into Allied-controlled airspace near the Algerian coast, P-51 Mustang fighters appeared. These long-range American fighters had been escorting other bomber formations and spotted the crippled B-17 struggling along far below normal formation altitude. The P-51s moved in close to assess the damage. What they saw shocked even these combat-hardened pilots. Through their radios, they contacted their base. "We've got a B-17 here that's been nearly cut in half. The tail section is waving like a fish tail. This aircraft is not going to make it. Suggest you send boats for water rescue. The crew will have to bail out." Inside. All American. The crew couldn't hear these radio transmissions. Their own radio was dead. But they could see the P-51 pilots flying alongside, close enough that Lieutenant Bragg could see their faces. The fighter pilots were making exaggerated gestures, pointing at the tail, making jumping motions with their hands. Bragg understood. The P-51 pilots thought All American was finished and that the crew should bail out. But Bragg had a problem. When he checked with his crew, he discovered that several parachutes had been damaged in the attack or its aftermath. Between damaged chutes and the one spare parachute they carried, they were at least one parachute short. Not everyone could bail out. Bragg made his decision instantly. He would stay with the aircraft and try to land it. If some of his crew couldn't bail out safely, then he wouldn't ask any of them to abandon ship. He signaled this decision to the P-51 pilots using hand gestures. The fighter pilots relayed the message to base. "The B-17 pilot says he's staying with the aircraft. He's going to try to land it." The P-51 stayed with All American flying escort, watching over the crippled bomber as it made its agonizing way toward the airfield. The airfield at Biskra came into view, the most beautiful sight the crew had ever seen. But landing presented entirely new challenges. Normal landing procedure involved lowering the landing gear, extending the flaps, reducing speed, and touching down at about 90 to 100 miles per hour. But nothing about this landing would be normal. "I'm going to keep power on and make a long, shallow approach," Bragg explained to his co-pilot. "If I reduce power too much or slow down too far, we might lose what little control we have." The landing gear extended normally, one of the few systems still working properly. But the tail wheel, mounted in the tail section, was inoperative. The hydraulic lines to it were severed. "We're going to land without a tail wheel," Bragg announced. "Everyone brace for impact and be ready to evacuate immediately after we stop." As they descended toward the runway, Bragg fired 3 red flares, the emergency signal. Ground crews and ambulances raced toward the runway. The other bombers in the formation had already landed and cleared the runway. Their crews stood watching as All American made its approach, many of them seeing the damage for the first time. Several men made the sign of the cross. Some turned away, unable to watch what they were certain would be a fatal crash. All American descended lower, the runway approaching fast. "Here we go," Bragg muttered. The main landing gear touched the dusty North African runway. The aircraft settled, rolling forward on the 2 main wheels. Then the tail section, with no tail wheel to support it, dropped heavily onto the runway. Metal shrieked against the ground. Sparks flew. The aircraft shuddered violently. But All American stayed together. She rolled forward, slowing, the damaged tail dragging behind like a wounded limb. "Cut the engines," Bragg ordered. Engel reached up and pulled the mixture controls to cut off. The 4 engines, 3 still running, spooled down to silence. All American rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust. They were home. Ambulances and fire trucks surrounded the aircraft immediately. Medical personnel rushed forward, expecting casualties. But when the crew emerged through the waist door and tail gunner Sarpelis climbed down a ladder from his isolated position, the medics made an astonishing discovery. Not a single crew member had been seriously injured. A few minor cuts and bruises, some frostbite from exposure through the open fuselage, but nothing requiring hospitalization. The medical crews simply stood there in disbelief. One of them waved off the ambulances. There were no patients to transport. The crew of All-American stood beside their aircraft, looking at the damage in full daylight for the first time. The tail section, having supported its own weight during the landing roll, now sagged dramatically. As they watched, with a grinding screech of failing metal, the entire tail section collapsed onto the ground. That single elevator cable had finally given up. If it had failed just minutes earlier, during flight, nobody wanted to think about it. Ground crews and maintenance personnel swarmed the aircraft, examining the damage, taking photographs, measuring, documenting. What they found was almost impossible to believe. The fuselage was cut approximately 75% through. Of all the control cables running to the tail, normally a dozen or more for the various control surfaces, only one remained intact, a single elevator cable. This cable, along with some residual structural strength in the right side of the frame near the horizontal stabilizer, was all that had kept the tail attached during the flight. The pieces of the Messerschmitt embedded in the wreckage, and the improvised lashings the crew had rigged probably helped stabilize the structure, but they contributed little actual load-bearing strength. It was primarily that one cable that had saved them. The U.S. Army Air Forces immediately began investigating the incident. Engineers wanted to understand how All-American had survived such catastrophic damage. The lessons learned could help save future crews. The investigation revealed several factors that contributed to the survival. Boeing's design philosophy. The B-17 was designed with multiple redundancies and exceptional structural strength. Even with 75% of a major structural member severed, enough remained to provide minimal integrity. Control cable quality. The elevator cable that remained intact was manufactured to exacting standards with significant safety margins. It was designed to handle forces far exceeding normal flight loads. On February 1, 1943, it exceeded even those design specifications. Crew actions. The improvised lashings and wedges the crew installed, while not strong enough to support the tail alone, did help stabilize it and reduce flexing that might have caused complete failure. Pilot skill. Lieutenant Bragg's extremely gentle handling of the controls prevented stress loads that would have snapped the remaining connections. His decision to make a long, slow turn rather than a normal radius turn was critical. Luck. Sometimes there's no other word for it. The Me-109's wing could have struck 12 inches higher or lower and caused instant catastrophic failure. The one cable that survived could have been positioned slightly differently and been severed. The tail could have broken off at any moment during the 2.5-hour flight home. The photographs taken at the airfield were classified initially but eventually became some of the most famous images of World War II. They showed All-American, with her tail section hanging by what appeared to be almost nothing, because it essentially was nothing more than one cable and some bent metal. The crew of All-American received recognition for their courage and skill. Lieutenant Bragg was commended for his flying ability and decision-making under impossible circumstances. The entire crew was cited for their actions in keeping the aircraft together and fighting off subsequent attacks. But what about All-American herself? Surprisingly, the aircraft was repaired and returned to service. Army Air Forces maintenance crews replaced the entire tail section, repaired the fuselage, and rebuilt the damaged systems. Within weeks, All-American was flying again. However, the repairs were never quite perfect. The aircraft developed persistent handling quirks, small asymmetries, minor control issues. Nothing dangerous, but enough that most crews preferred not to fly her on combat missions. All-American was reassigned to utility duties, transport, training, courier service. She served in this capacity for the remainder of the war, eventually being scrapped at Foggia, Italy, in March 1945. Lieutenant Bragg completed his combat tour and returned to the United States. He became an instructor pilot, training new B-17 crews. After the war, he left active service and pursued a civilian career. He passed away on October 13, 1999, at the age of 81. Other crew members also survived the war. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge, who gave several interviews about the mission in later years, lived to be 92, passing away in February 2013. Tail gunner Sam Sarpelis, the man who spent 2.5 hours trapped in a tail section hanging by a thread, died in 1988 at age 70. Over the years, the story of All-American has been told and retold, and like many legendary tales, it has accumulated embellishments and inaccuracies. Some accounts claim the crew used parachutes to physically hold the tail together. Others say they opened the bomb bay doors after the collision to release bombs they had already dropped earlier. In interviews conducted years later, surviving crew members corrected many of these myths. They had already completed their bombing run when the collision occurred. They were wearing their parachutes, not using them to lash the aircraft together. They landed in North Africa, not England as some accounts claim. The P-51 fighters that escorted them home did not attack any additional German fighters during the escort. Ralph Burbridge, in particular, worked to set the record straight, emphasizing that while the incident was certainly dramatic and frightening, the embellished versions did a disservice to the actual achievement, which was impressive enough without exaggeration. The core facts remain undisputed and astonishing. A Mi-109 fighter nearly cut a B-17 in half. One control cable and minimal structural connection kept the tail attached. The aircraft flew for over 2 hours in this condition. The crew fought off additional attacks. The pilot landed successfully. Not one crew member was seriously injured. The survival of All-American provided valuable data for Boeing engineers and the Army Air Forces. Several improvements to the B-17 design were implemented based on lessons learned. Control system redundancy. Already robust, the control cable routing was further optimized in later B-17 variants to minimize the chances of a single impact severing all cables to a control surface. Structural reinforcement. The aft fuselage structure, where tail section connected to the main body, received additional reinforcement in subsequent production models. Emergency procedures. New procedures were developed for handling catastrophic structural damage. Crews were trained specifically on scenarios where major structural elements were compromised. Escape equipment. Recommendations were made, though not always implemented due to weight considerations, for carrying additional emergency equipment, including spare parachutes and structural repair materials. But perhaps the most important lesson was simply this: the B-17 Flying Fortress earned its nickname through sheer toughness. Time and again, B-17s brought their crews home despite damage that should have been unsurvivable. All-American became an icon of this resilience, a symbol that inspired countless bomber crews throughout the war. When crews faced terrifying damage to their own aircraft, they remembered All-American and found the courage to keep fighting, keep flying, and bring their birds home. Lost sometimes in the technical marvels and dramatic photographs is the human story. 10 young men who faced death together and survived through skill, courage, and teamwork. Consider tail gunner Sam Sarpelis. He spent 2.5 hours in a tail section that was literally hanging by a thread, bouncing and flexing in the airstream, knowing that at any second the tail might break off and send him plummeting to his death. He couldn't escape. The missing floor made it impossible for him to crawl forward. If the tail broke off, he was dead. Yet Sarpelis didn't panic. He remained at his position, operated his guns when enemy fighters attacked, and waited with remarkable calm for whatever fate had in store. That kind of courage, quiet, determined, unglamorous courage, defined the men who flew in bomber crews during World War II. Or consider Lieutenant Bragg, the pilot, who could have ordered his crew to bail out when the P-51 pilots signaled that the aircraft was doomed. Some of his crew might have made it. But Bragg refused to abandon anyone. When he learned they were short parachutes, he made the instant decision: if everyone couldn't bail out safely, then no one would. He would bring them all home or die trying. That decision, a commander refusing to save himself if it meant leaving even one crew member behind, exemplifies the bond that existed between bomber crews. They weren't just assigned to fly together. They became brothers, bound by shared danger and absolute mutual dependence. Each crew member played his part. Engineer James monitored the failing engines and advised on power management. Navigator Newsell plotted the most direct route home. Bombardier Burbridge helped coordinate the damage assessment. Radio operator Galloway, though his equipment was destroyed, served as an extra set of hands for emergency repairs. The gunners fought off attacks while simultaneously working to stabilize the structure. It was total teamwork under impossible stress, 10 men functioning as one organism, each trusting the others with his life. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, please subscribe and like it, and join our community of history lovers. We want to hear your voice. Leave a comment on the video, tell us where you come from, or share any family history related to the war. You are not just a spectator, you are helping us spread the truth about the heroism of the war years. We read every comment, and they really inspire us to work. See you next time.